Hi, everyone. Really excited to see so many people here. If you're still getting pizza, no worries, but as soon as you get your pizza, come and find a table because we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name's Carolina. I'm a grad student here at MIT, and I'm involved with Crew. We're the group putting on this event, and we're a passionate community who is interested in connecting students to Jesus and the love of Jesus on campus. So if you guys want to know more about Crew, you can talk to a lot of us after. But we're really excited to have Dr. Tom Rudelius here with us tonight. If you guys didn't read his bio already in the event, Tom Rudelius completed his undergrad work at Cornell and earned a doctorate in physics at Harvard, and then conducted postdoc research at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He's currently a postdoc researcher in theoretical physics at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's going to begin a faculty position at Durham University in the UK in the fall. His research focuses on string theory, quantum field theory, and early universe cosmology. So he's definitely like an MIT level nerd. And he's also a man of faith and an avid sports fan, and he's frequently requested to speak on topics related to science and faith, which is going to be kind of our main focus for tonight. He's also on the board of the Mamelodi Initiative, which is a tutoring organization based in Mamelodi, South Africa. Cool, so thank you so much for being here, Tom. Can we give him a round of applause? Thanks, guys.
Thanks, yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool, so just a couple logistics about how tonight's gonna work. I'm gonna start off just asking Tom some interview questions, we're also gonna have the concert band practicing below us, so if you hear background music, that's what that is. But I'm gonna ask Tom some questions, and then you guys will have the chance to fill out a form, and we're gonna have, if you put it up on the slide, there we go. There's a QR code, so all you have to do to ask a question is to scan that code with your phone, and you can submit the question anonymously. And the way that the Slido app works is that even if you don't have a question, you should scan the code because you can upvote other people's questions to see which questions you want answered the most. So basically, type in your questions as Tom is talking, or afterwards. We'll have a designated period for Q&A, but to start off, I'm just gonna ask some questions I have here. But we'll leave that QR code up the whole time so you guys can ask. Okay, cool. So to start off, I'm curious if you could just tell us a little bit more about your research and what you're doing going forward.
Okay, so as you mentioned, my research deals with string theory and cosmology and quantum field theory. So lately, most of my work has dealt with string theory. String theory is this theory about kind of physics at its most fundamental level, but there isn't a lot of experimental evidence for it. It's very difficult to test experimentally, and part of the reason for that is that it's hard to extract any sort of unique predictions from string theory. So that's what most of my research lately has focused on, is trying to make predictions from string theory that hopefully could someday lead to an experimental test of it. But to be honest, we're probably still a couple of steps away from that ultimate goal.
Wow, that's cool. If you guys have questions about string theory, you can put those in the Slido too. To ask a question more related to faith, tell us about your upbringing and the role that religion played.
So religion, I would have said, probably didn't play a huge role in my upbringing. I was raised in a very loving family. I have a mom and a dad and a twin brother named Steve, and growing up, we never went to church, never read the Bible. Most of what I knew about religion came from watching cartoons. So for me, the view that I had internalized of religion from my family, from my environment, is that religion is really about helping people to live happy lives and to be more moral people. And I always kind of figured, well, I'm basically a good person, and I have a pretty happy life, and so religion just was something that didn't seem all that important to me when I was growing up.
Gotcha. Okay, so tell us about how, to start off, how that sort of started to change for you. Tell us about your relationship with your brother and how that played a role in your faith journey.
So I mentioned I have a twin brother named Steve, and we went off to different colleges. So I went to Cornell. Steve went to Northwestern University just outside of Chicago. And his freshman year at Northwestern, Steve met a guy on his floor named Matt, who was probably like the first really serious thinking Christian that either of us had ever met. And this was a big deal to Steve at the time, because both of us had kind of grown up with this view that, religion is sort of anti-scientific, that it's not something that we rational people should believe in. At the same time, though, my brother, the summer after his senior year of high school, he started having these obsessive thoughts about death. Like, he just woke up one day and realized, like, I'm going to die, and that's going to be the end of me. And, like, why isn't everybody else as freaked out about this as I am? So he thought about that just about every day that summer, just kind of obsessively thinking about death and the end of his existence. And so, he had kind of looked into different views on the afterlife, and he just didn't find anything very compelling. It all just seemed kind of like wishful thinking. And so when he met Matt, who was this smart guy, he was an engineer at Northwestern, he was a really good student and a smart person, and he believed in God. He actually believed in an afterlife. That was a big deal to Steve, because it was kind of like, maybe I can have it both ways. Maybe I can have the hope that there's something more to this world than just I die and that's it, without having to sacrifice my intellectual credibility. So to make a long story short, Steve ultimately came to faith the April of our freshman year of college, and he wanted me to come to faith as well. So he tried to give me a copy of the Bible to read, and he tried to give me some other books about Christianity. And I told him, look, Steve, I have trouble finding time to read books that I want to read, much less time to read books that I don't want to read. That's just where I was at with religion. But it was in part curiosity, and it was in part a desire not to lose my twin brother. He had all of a sudden become this like super religious person, and I was worried about what that was going to mean for him. So it's like, if he's going to be spending all of his time going to church and reading the Bible and stuff, well, I want to at least try to share that with him if I can, even if I don't necessarily believe it. And so I started to read the Bible. I started to read some books about Christianity that he had. He had a copy of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, arguing against Christianity. So I just started kind of diving into this whole question of the existence of God. I started going to church with him, having a lot of conversations with him about the meaning and purpose of life and God and religion. And so a lot of my faith journey really came out of that interaction with him, and really because of his own faith journey before me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing his story with us as well. So you mentioned you were reading a lot of things that he tried to introduce you to, and I'm curious if there's anything that sticks in your mind as something particularly influential that you read. Yeah,
that's a really good question. I think the first book about Christianity that I read, which was a really good introduction for me, was a book called Letters from a Skeptic. It's a correspondence between a pastor whose name is Greg Boyd, and his dad, whose name was Edward, who was a skeptic. And so this was an actual correspondence of letters that the two had, where essentially the father would write, these are all the reasons I can't believe in God. And he would have all of these objections. And as I read them as a skeptic, I really resonated with them, right? They're just all the right questions, the same questions, the same doubts that everyone has. And then I would read Greg's response, and it wasn't necessarily convincing. It's not like I read the book and I decided to become a Christian immediately, but it was surprising, I guess, how well thought out his responses were. It was clear that Greg had spent a lot of time thinking about these questions. There wasn't anything new. There wasn't anything that surprised him. And I think that was encouraging, just to see that, these Christians, they're not all a bunch of idiots. They've thought about these questions too, and they've come to answers that they find satisfying. So maybe I could find answers like that too. The other book, I guess, that was important for me was just the New Testament that my brother gave me. I think I had a lot of misconceptions about what religion was all about, what Christianity was all about, what Jesus was all about, and the more I read the New Testament, I think the more that those preconceived notions started to seem like they were misconceptions.
Yeah, thank you. I've also read the Letters from a Skeptic, and I remember like, oh wow, yeah, I'm also resonating with parts of this. But I'm curious how like your faith continued to evolve, you know, through reading things. If there was like a moment sort of that you would describe when things really shifted.
Yeah. So it's funny that I mean the moment that I would credit with becoming a Christian, it wasn't like a conversation with my brother. It wasn't reading anything. It wasn't going to church. It was seemingly completely unrelated series of events where for the summer after my sophomore year of college, I applied for a bunch of internships, and I got an offer from the National Security Agency, which was contingent upon going in and completing a polygraph test, colloquially known as a lie detector. And I went in there, fired up the machine, did the questions, and I realized pretty quickly that this test wasn't really a lie detector, that it was going to fail me, not only if I were lying, but just if I felt guilty about anything. Anything that would make me respond physiologically and register on the test as deception of some sort. So, you know, they would ask me a question like, have you committed any serious crimes? And I would start thinking about the times that I snuck into high school football games without paying like the $5 entrance fee. And it's like, I know deep down that that's not the sort of serious crimes that they're after, right? They want to know, like, have I ever like hacked into like the CIA database and like stolen information and give it to the Russians or something like that. But it's like as soon as I started thinking about sneaking into those high school football games, it was hard to just like turn my brain off and not think about that and not worry about it. And as soon as I started worrying, that counts as deception, right? So basically, you know, we did the test a couple times, or probably 4 or 5 times throughout the whole process. And in between, I just would basically confess everything that I could think of that I'd done wrong in my life that might show up on this test. The whole process lasted 4 hours, and it was kind of in that moment where Christianity just started to make sense to me, because one of the things that my brother and I had argued about, I can like distinctly remember this particular argument over the question of, are people mostly good or not? And my feeling was, you know, okay, sure, there's like the Hitlers of the world, but most of us are just good people. You know, we're generally good. We generally do good things. And I certainly felt that way about myself. You know, I'm a good person. If there's a heaven, I'll probably go to it. But going into there, taking that polygraph test, having to just confess all the things I'd done wrong in my life, I started to realize that, you know, deep down I'm not as good of a person as I like to think I am. And I've done a lot of things that I'm not proud of. And all of a sudden this message that my brother had been telling me about how people, even the best people, are broken and have done wrong and are in need of forgiveness, that story started to make sense of my own experience. And so it's interesting because, you know, part of me wants to say, you know, like as a scientist, the moment I became a Christian was the moment I read this argument, and this argument was so convincing, and then I just, you know, rationally decided that this must be the answer. And it had, by the time I took the polygraph, I had gotten to a point where I was really starting to believe that Christianity was reasonable, and maybe even the most reasonable worldview. But there was just this disconnect between my intellect and my experience, where I could believe that this is reasonable and also feel like, well, I don't know if I really want to live my whole life for this. Like, I don't know if I want to just turn everything upside down. Like, I have a pretty good life right now, and I don't know if I want to make all the commitments that are involved with becoming a religious person, with becoming a follower of Jesus. So it was really that moment, that kind of that experience that convinced me that this is something that I actually need, right? That I too am in need of forgiveness, and if I am, then probably everyone else is too. So it's not so much that the arguments changed, but in light of my new experience and my new view of myself, faith just made more sense. And it made sense that this is something that I should actually devote myself to.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. It's a really unique and cool testimony. I've never heard anyone talk about a polygraph test before, convincing them that God and Christianity might be real, but So one more question before we move into Q&A is, were people around you, like your friends or your family, surprised when you became a Christian, especially if you shared this testimony with them? And how did your relationships with them change?
This is a question that I'm often asked. Kind of how do your relationship with your family and your friends change, and also how does your faith affect your relationship in science, like with other scientists? And I've never really had a good answer to any of those questions because there really isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. Like some of my family members my mom especially, I remember was really happy that I had come to faith, and she actually started going back to church herself around that same time. My brother was definitely ecstatic, after all the conversations that we had, that I had come to faith. Some of my other families probably just didn't really care that much. With some of them, I had some arguments about theology kind of in the months after that didn't really go anywhere. I guess it's tough to say as I say, it's tough to kind of give a one-size-fits-all answer. But I think that in the years since then, I've really come a long way in terms of being able to talk with my family about my faith, and to be able to find common ground even, amidst a family that has pretty different religious views than I do.
One more question before we go to Q&A is that you recently wrote a book, which we have many copies of back there if you guys haven't gotten one yet, called Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. And I'm just curious, like, how you, one, decided you wanted to write a book, and two, like, what that process looked like, how it affected your faith as you wrote it.
So the book was, I guess I started writing down the book, some parts of the book, especially the early chapters, many years ago, thinking that maybe someday my story could be a book, and I wanted to make sure things were written down before I forgot them. And it was actually a really good thing I did, because as I came back years later to sit down and write it in earnest, as I was reading it, I was like, oh, I forgot that happened. So it's a good thing I wrote some things down. A couple years ago, someone from Tyndale House Publishing called me, the people who published my book, and they asked me if I wanted to write a book. I think it was something about like faith and Euclidean wormholes, or something like really specific to my field of physics. And I said, man, I don't think I have much to say about faith and Euclidean wormholes. Like I don't think that there's not a book to be written there. Maybe there's like a tweet or something, but there's not, I don't think I could do that. But I suggested, what if I were to write something more of a memoir instead, and just tell my story? And I thought this would probably be more accessible and more fun to read anyway. So that is what came out, Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. Yeah.
Thank you. I think our next event should be titled Faith in Euclidean Wormholes.
Oh
we can invite you back.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think we'll start with some of the questions. We have a lot of questions here, and a lot of the first ones are very related to physics and science. So our top question right now is, how do you confront the religious theories for the origins of the universe, given your scientific understanding of cosmology?
Okay, yeah. So I think I gave a really long talk about this here a couple of years ago. You were there for that, right? Yeah. So I have more to say there, but I guess what I would say in a sentence is that I think that science, and this is maybe a more general point of philosophy on science and faith, I think for a lot of people, they tend to view science and religious faith as offering two completely distinct and even incompatible approaches to the same questions. Questions like, for instance, how did the universe come into existence? And from that perspective, right, you kind of run into this conflict of like, well, what if science says this, but the Bible says this? What I've found, I think, is that, in years now of actually walking the journey of faith and walking the journey of science, I would say that actually science and faith, for me, offer very similar approaches to different types of questions, where science tends to answer questions more about mechanisms and how things work, and how the world has come to be the way it is. And I think that faith tends to offer answers to questions about meaning and purpose, and ultimately why are we all here? And I think the issues arise when people try to use science to answer questions about, say, morality and ethics. And I think that the issues arise similarly when people try to use religious faith to try to answer questions that are best answered by science. So I think for me, I trust what science says about the origin of the universe and the origin of the planet and so on and so forth. And so to me, I guess when I look at the Bible as a Christian, I view it as giving us more of a description of why God has brought this world into existence in the first place, and what is the nature, what is the character of the God who has created everything, not so much exactly a step-by-step formula of how God exactly did it. And I would also point out to conclude that this isn't just like a modern view that modern people faced with science now needed to revise the way that they thought about the opening chapters of Genesis. But even if you go back like thousands of years, you read people like Augustine and his contemporaries arguing about whether or not the opening words of Genesis should be taken literally, or whether they should be viewed as a more literal or literary framework. So I think that, in the end, I think that there isn't so much tension there as long as we read everything the right way and as long as we interpret science the right way.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great answer. And it's a really good point, too, that like these aren't just modern questions. These are things scientists have been wrestling over for a long time. So even though we have more science now, it doesn't mean that we didn't have it back then and scientists weren't thinking about it back then.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So a question related to that, because I know you mentioned that a lot of the time you think that when people think physics or science in general is incompatible with faith, it's because it's they're trying to use it to answer the wrong questions. So someone here has asked, often things in theoretical physics are used to discredit the existence of God. How have you wrestled with this given that you're in this field?
Yeah, I might push back on that a little bit. I think that that what we found in physics kind of there's some things that maybe push against theism a bit. There's some other things that I think push in favor of theism. For instance, a lot of my research deals around questions of fine-tuning and why the laws of nature seem to be tuned exactly the way that they need to be to give rise to intelligent life. I think that things like that argument, and that's another thing I know I've talked about at length in past years here. I think that that's something that is well explained by theism, and it's something that points to the existence of God. I think that definitely there are, sometimes people talk about theories of the beginning of the universe. People talk about things like multiverses. I think something that being in science has shown me is just how speculative all of these theories are at the moment. That's something that I realize now that scientists don't always do a great job of communicating what are the results that are really well established in their field and what are the things that are much more speculative ideas. I think that those are speculative ideas in general, but I also think that even if say we had a theory that exactly explains how the universe came into existence, as I said before, there's still kind of this separation between questions like how did the Big Bang happen, how did the world come into existence, and then the deeper questions of why did this happen in the first place? Is there any meaning behind it? Why these particular laws of nature as opposed to something else? That those deeper metaphysical questions I think are still unanswered, and that is I think where faith comes into and theology comes into the story.
That's a good point. So there's a couple other questions that also are asking sort of how you navigate being a scientist or being a physicist specifically in communities that are often non-religious, especially because there are like many brilliant theorists that are atheists, and a lot of them are very vocal about it. So I'm curious how you like respond to colleagues who are atheists, or even just like well-known figures in science who are atheists.
Yeah, definitely. So there's kind of the practical question of how do I actually respond in these situations. And then there's the question of how would I intellectually respond? How do I practically respond is usually not very well. And I kind of think of something a few hours later that I'm like, darn, I should have said that.
Thanks for your honesty.
Yeah. A lot of the time, I mean, sometimes I hear physicists, and this is something else I talk about in my book, is where there's such a big mix of reactions to other physicists. Sometimes I hear physicists at lunch making fun of religion without realizing that I'm a religious person. Sometimes I've heard other physicists who are also not religious kind of push back on that and argue well, a lot of religious people are really well-meaning, and this is good, and it's not necessarily wrong. And so so I definitely see a big mix, and I feel like I never really know exactly what to say or how to respond. But what I would say, I guess what I've kind of learned from being around some really brilliant atheistic physicists in my field is that it kind of always surprises me when I start to hear them explain maybe some of the reasons why they don't believe, how similar those reasons are to just about anyone you'd find on the street. I had a conversation one time, chronicled in my book, that with a supporter, a financial supporter of the Institute for Advanced Study where I was a postdoc, and Ed Witten, Ed Witten is the man in theoretical physics. He's unquestionably the greatest in our field and just really one of the most brilliant people in the world. And the whole time we were talking about faith, this other guy brought up faith, and we were talking about religion and God. And Ed Witten didn't say too much at all, except for one time, the question on the topic of miracles, he said, I think a lot of people think that, I think that a lot of people wish that God would intervene a lot more often, which is a good point, right? And it's ultimately, that's the problem of evil and suffering, of if God is good and powerful and loving, then why doesn't he step in and intervene more often and prevent evil and suffering? It's a good question, but if we were to go ask anyone on the street, what if you could ask God one question, they're going to ask, why do you allow evil and suffering? We can go back and read the Psalms, and we can read Genesis, and it's clear that the people writing those were wrestling over these same questions of if God is good, then why is there evil and suffering? And so I think it's telling that the smartest man in the world, he's asking the same question. We're all asking the same question, and so I don't think that in the end I don't think that the brilliant people necessarily have a huge advantage when it comes to these questions. This isn't string theory. This isn't really complicated mathematics. It's the same questions, and I think that different people find different answers more compelling than others.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. You brought up miracles briefly, and one of the questions on here is asking, how do you think miracles can be physically possible?
Yeah. So this was a question that I would say it was as I look back, it was a question that bothered me before I came to faith, and it was maybe the first one that I felt got answered, suitably answered during the course of my faith journey. In a sentence, I think that science tells us how the world works in the absence of supernatural intervention. It doesn't tell us whether or not supernatural intervention is possible in the first place. I think that the view that miracles are impossible because they contradict science really just assumes atheism. Because I think that if atheism is true, then there are these laws of nature which not only describe reality, but actually define reality. That's all there is, which means that there's nothing outside of the laws themselves that could jump in and intervene in those laws. But if God exists, which is really the whole question here, right? If God exists, then I think it's sensible and perhaps even expected that God would sometimes intervene in the laws of nature. Exactly what Ed Witten was asking, right? I think the right question, if God exists, isn't are miracles possible? The right question is, why doesn't God do more miracles? So I think that it's very much consistent to believe that there are these laws of nature that describe reality, and then occasionally, for certain purposes, God may decide to intervene in those laws. And I think that's a perfectly consistent worldview to have.
Got it. A question related to that is someone's wondering how you would explain things like demons, spirits, heaven, hell, and other spiritual realities to your colleagues or to anyone.
Yeah. Oh boy. I think a lot of those are kind of confusing to me still. Like when and something I talk a lot in my book about is my experience with anxiety and doubt. I've had seasons of really bad anxiety that often involve doubting my faith. It's happened a few times for a few months since I became a Christian. And in those moments, I can really see how someone, when I read the Bible, I read about people being demon possessed. I can really resonate with that feeling when I'm struggling with anxiety, when I'm struggling with these like obsessive doubts, that it does kind of feel like there's some other voice in my head that's like just lying to me, right? And so when I read those passages in the Bible about demon possession, I always wonder, like, is that what we today would just call anxiety or depression or OCD or something? Or is it something different? Or is this maybe just two sides of the same coin, right? That there's sort of like a spiritual, there's sort of like a biological explanation, and then if you peel back the layer of mechanism and look instead for the deeper meaning, that's where there's kind of these deeper spiritual realities. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I guess I think that ultimately there's a way to believe in these sort of spiritual realities while simultaneously believing that there's a physical description, and that these two different descriptions can operate simultaneously. There's a famous quote from C.S. Lewis that along the lines of, if somebody were to ask you, like, why is the water boiling? I could give some long thermodynamic explanation for how boiling works and how phase transitions work, or I could just say, because I wanted to make a cup of tea, right? And both of those are answering the question, why is the water boiling? But one's a physical answer and one's a more metaphysical answer, and they can operate simultaneously.
Yeah, I really love that quote, so thanks for sharing it. And I think this is a question I also struggle with a lot, so I really appreciate hearing your thoughts on it. Going off of that, someone else is asking, are there any questions, other than that you're still struggling with surrounding Christianity, even with your understanding of how science and faith interact?
Yeah, definitely. I always give the same answer to this. I think that there are a ton of bad objections to Christianity and theism. I think that there are three good ones, and then different like versions of these three. I think that the problem of evil and suffering is a serious question that theism has to deal with. To me, it's probably the least. I actually feel like I've come to the best place on this compared to of these three questions, but it's definitely a serious one. The second question that's related to it that bothers me a lot is the hiddenness of God, which is something I've already raised. Why doesn't God do more miracles? Why doesn't God make it more obvious that he exists? Why do we even have to have debates about the existence of God? Like, why doesn't he just make it completely obvious? And then the third thing that bothers me is a lot of the difficult stuff that you find in that Bible. I love the Bible, in many ways. Like, I love how it fits together so beautifully, different books written centuries apart. And I never would have come to faith if it weren't for the Bible. At the same time, there's some things in that Bible that just make me say, like, I don't know, man. I don't know about that one. So yeah, I think that those for me are like the three things that have kind of been continual things that I've kind of chewed on. And I would say, and fortunately right now, I'm not in one of those really terrible seasons of like anxiety and obsessive doubt. But I would say that those three arguments, for me, do push the needle, further away from theism towards atheism. But I also feel that at this point, I've kind of settled on good enough responses that aren't completely satisfying, but enough that they still don't push the needle more than halfway. Like, I still think that with those arguments, I still would lean towards theism, but I can definitely see how people would go the other way and say, the hiddenness of God, the problems of the Bible, the problem of evil and suffering are just too much for me to believe.
Yeah, it's a really good breakdown. Just to like dive into that a little bit more, I'm curious how you arrived at a good place, especially with the question of evil and suffering. Not even so much like what your arguments are, but more like how you went through the process of saying like, of dealing with doubt and saying, you know, I feel comfortable in not being certain about these things.
Yeah, man, that's a really good question. I guess it's interesting, and man, I'm sorry I like keep saying like, this is in my book, but this is in my book.
Get the book, guys.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I think everyone got
Yeah,
a
exactly.
free copy, hopefully. But yeah, this is something that kind of, it just kind of, it's hard to even say because it feels like sometimes just the answers come out of nowhere. Like all of a sudden, I'll hear a sermon, or my friend will point me to some book or something that has some really interesting thing to say. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can say a little bit, I think, about the problem of evil and suffering, which is that, and really a lot of the issues that I've had with theism started to make more sense once I started to started to view the world as a story, which sounds a little bit weird, right? But I think like as an atheist, the best way to view the world is as some sort of mathematical structure, that there are these laws of nature, these equations that not only describe reality but actually define reality. I think as a theist, the best way to understand the world is not as a mathematical structure, but rather as this cosmic narrative that we're all a part of. You know, that we're all characters in this story. And so much of our experience actually makes sense of this, right? That we experience a flow of time. We experience time flowing past, which is pretty wild from a physics perspective, right? We actually experience time as it moves past. We have emotions, we have feelings. We can relate to each other in intelligent ways. You know, we're not just like brains sitting in vats somewhere. That we relate to each other like characters in a story. And I think from this perspective, the problem of evil and suffering, or the existence of evil and suffering, isn't so much a problem, it's more just a feature. Because every great story has suffering, every great story has conflict. And oftentimes it's the greatest stories that even have the most evil and the most suffering, because the worse things are at their worst, the greater the joy is when it finally comes. And so I think from that perspective, when I think of our world as a story and I start to think about, you know, what would need to happen to bring about that happily ever after, I think I see a lot of that in the story of Jesus. Jesus as the hero of the story, his resurrection as the climax of the story, in which evil and death are defeated and good miraculously triumphs. So that to me makes a lot of sense. It makes sense out of miracles, it makes sense out of time, it makes sense out of the problem of evil and suffering, and a lot of other things as well. So I think, even more importantly, it's something that makes sense out of my life in an existential level. Because I really don't know how to live if the world is just a mathematical structure. Like, I don't know objectively, like I can make up my own meaning and purpose, but I don't know objectively what I'm supposed to do if all I am is math and motion. But if we're all part of this larger story, I think that's something that actually gives our lives meaning and purpose that we can live into.
Thanks for that explanation. So you've talked a lot about going from atheism to Christianity, but there's a question up here asking why you think Christianity specifically is the most reasonable religion among all the religions in the world, because clearly theism is, you know, not just Christianity.
Yeah, so. Definitely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, this is such a long answer, and I'm also not the world expert on other faiths, but I can tell you that something that really attracted me to Christianity in the first place, I guess a couple things. One is that Christianity is based really on a historical person and a historical event, which means that it's something that we can investigate, right? We can probe it, we can do tests on it, we can try to arrive at truth, you know, getting our hands dirty with actual historical data. To me, as a scientist, that's something that's appealing, right? That like there's a lot more data to be sorted through for Christianity than there is for string theory. So like that to me is something that was appealing. Another thing that I found especially appealing about Christianity was just the person of Jesus. Reading him, and as I read the New Testament, I kind of found myself thinking, and I'm not sure if I would have put it this way at the time, but I think I more or less found myself thinking, you know, if there is a God, I would hope that he would be like this. And so, yeah, I guess to me, I'd say that, excuse me, like for someone who's kind of looking at different faiths, I'm not sure if I could give you like the best argument for why you should prefer Christianity. What I would say is that just go like read the New Testament and read about Jesus. And I'm definitely not the first person to kind of come away from that feeling like there's something special about this guy.
Thanks for that explanation. This question sort of relates to that, but it's how does your experiential knowledge of God, like walking with him daily, inform your faith in a way that your intellectual knowledge of God and science doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I'm struggling to say, to give an answer to how that is, but I definitely do feel like that's an important part of it, right? That God isn't just some intellectual belief for us, right? Like Christianity isn't at its heart just about this argument, this debate about whether or not God exists. It's actually really about a relationship with the God who is. And so I think that, you know, part of you know, when I've had these seasons of anxiety, these seasons of doubt, you know, there's kind of this intellectual component where these arguments that I've gone to for why I believe just don't like hit the same way that they sometimes do. And I've found kind of in those moments and more generally that the arguments I think can bring, like, I think the arguments for Christianity are better than the arguments against it. Like, I think Christianity is true, but those arguments have never really brought me peace, you know? I think the arguments, the best they'll ever do is kind of get you to this place where you have this debate raging in your head. But ultimately what Jesus and what God offers us through Jesus is peace, you know, is a relationship with him, and a community of faith, a community of other people who are brought together by this common thing. And so I think that kind of if you stay short of that, right, if it's only ever the arguments, then you're never actually going to experience what real faith is all about. You know, it's not just about an intellectual belief. It's about the experience of God.
Yeah. I think that's a really good distinction to make. I think for most of the people that like I've talked to and the stories that I've heard, there's always the element of like the arguments and arguing and figuring it out scientifically, and then like the like personal, emotional, spiritual experience. So we have some questions here though that are like more on the argument and debate side, specifically regarding the Bible. And so one question up here is asking, if the Bible is truth, then it must be taken literally. And if not, what's the line between a literal interpretation and analogy? And like, how can you be certain that people are interpreting it the right way, or that you're interpreting it the right way?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think that is a difficult question, and there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer. But I would definitely push back on the idea that like truth has to be literal. I think that's a very modern view, you know, that we want our information to come to us in textbook form and like newspaper form, right, where it's exactly the propositions, exactly the statements, exactly the facts. But I mean, just like whether, even if you, right, regardless of what your view is on Scripture, like there's no denying that parts of it are written in poem. Jesus himself, when he speaks, he speaks in parables, which are these fictional, i.e. not literal, not historical stories that are designed to convey some moral or theological point. So there's no question that the Bible is full of metaphor, of symbolism, of poetry, of psalm, of proverb. And so then the question is always, is how do we know what genre we're reading? You know, how do we know what exactly this is trying to convey to us? And is this, you know, sometimes it's easy to tell when something is supposed to be historical. Sometimes it's easy to tell that it's not, and sometimes it's somewhere in the middle. But I think that, you know, ultimately, there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty in this. There's uncertainty in everything. There's uncertainty in every aspect of our lives. There's uncertainty in science. That's why every scientific experiment has error bars, right? And uncertainties with like a plus or minus, hence the cover of the book. So like, uncertainty is an escapable thing, and that's going to be true when it comes to interpreting the Bible too. But I think that the best thing for us to do in the midst of that uncertainty is to just be honest about it and to recognize that it is there, and therefore to be humble when it comes to how we interpret the Bible. I think there's, when it comes to the things that are really foundational for our faith, I think that we can have a high degree of confidence in those. And then I think for a lot of more peripheral issues and a lot of more secondary theological questions, there's often multiple viewpoints that can be reasonable, and reasonable people can disagree. And I think as Christians, our job is, not necessarily to always get the right answers, because I don't think anyone's ever going to do that. But I think it's our job to do it with humility and love.
So how would you respond to people who argue that the Bible, can't be truth, because when sometimes people read it and use it to justify things that other Christians are like, no, that's not in the Bible. Like, for example, slavery, subjugation of women, those types of things. A lot of the time people are like, well, if you read the Bible one way, you can use it to justify these things. And so what is your response to that type of argument?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, when I say that this is the third question that bothers me is some of that stuff in that Bible, you kind of hit the nail on the head. That some of those things really bother me, and to me, I think that is, I can definitely see how people would look at that and say, man, I don't know if this Bible is for me. I guess where I've come to on that is I think that, although yes, you look historically what Christians have done in the name of God, and there's some pretty awful atrocities. I think where I find some comfort in the midst of that is just looking at Jesus and knowing that Jesus talked a lot, and Jesus had real problems with hypocritical religious people who used their faith to oppress others. And so for me, it's, I can look at parts of the Bible and say, man, I really don't like that. But I think I find it encouraging that when I look at Jesus, I kind of see that he doesn't seem to like that either. And that to me is again, not completely compelling. This is probably the thing that has bothered me most about Christianity. But ultimately, I'm a Christian not because I love everything in the Bible, but I'm a Christian because I love Jesus and I love who he is, and that for me is good enough to kind of keep me following him.
That's a good point. I'm curious if you have any experiences in which you've had to have a conversation about that type of thing with a colleague or address someone who's come up with an argument of basically the ways that the Bible's been used to oppress people and the ways Christians have made mistakes in history.
I'm trying to think of that.
Sorry, tough
definitely,
question.
Yeah, definitely never heard a colleague say that, point that out. I don't think. Maybe once. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would probably just say what I said to you now. That I can see how people, are definitely bothered by that, and I am too. But I think Jesus is too, and so. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much all I can say, I think.
Okay. So one other question we have here is, given the rapid pace of scientific and technological advancements, how do you think these changes will impact society's spiritual and moral compass? Oh boy, I'm really not good at forecasting how AI or whatever is going to change the future. Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? The main point of the question is just how you think as society becomes more technologically advanced and as we further develop scientific theories and understanding how that's going to impact the way that we see spiritual things and maybe the way that we view God. Kind of a huge question, but
yeah. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is I think that there is a viewpoint that exists that the more we know about science, the less room there's going to be for God in it. And I think that I would definitely push back on that viewpoint, in part because, as I said, I think that these two are largely answering different questions. But I also just think that it kind of, misunderstands what science is all about and where exactly science is going. One could say, we've learned so much from science, like surely it's going to someday tell us everything there is to know. But you could say that about the integers too. Like, man, we've learned so much about the integers. Someday we're surely going to find out that an elephant is just a really big integer, which is clearly wrong, right? Like we all know. You're not going to eventually count high enough that you get an elephant. So I think it's similar here, where we're going to learn a lot about science, but I think it's a mistake to think that like physics is ever going to just completely take the role of metaphysics.
That's a good point. This question is slightly related to that, but it's a follow-up to your response about miracles, and it's asking, there's a difference between miracles being possible versus plausible. Think of string theory versus 3 sigma observation. Do miracles actually occur?
Yeah, that's a much better question. So I think, in part, this is going to depend on whether we're, first of all, is the world, is atheism true? Is the world a mathematical structure? In which case, I'm happy to say, extremely, extremely unlikely, or maybe even impossible that a miracle takes place. Or theism, right? I think if theism is true, that we would expect to see miracles. I think a lot of us, right? If I were to tell you, God exists, a lot of people would say, well, then where is he? Where are these miracles, right? So the question then becomes, okay, given that we see so few miracles, should that tell us that there are just no miracles, right? That kind of, I haven't seen a miracle in my life. Probably most of you haven't seen a miracle either. Can we just kind of conclude from never seeing one for so long that miracles can just never happen? So the problem with this, though, is that it kind of assumes that miracles should just happen randomly with like a Poisson distribution, and if we wait long enough we haven't seen one, well then that's good evidence that they just never happen whatsoever. But I think if indeed it's true that our world is best viewed as a story, then really where we should expect to see miracles is not just randomly distributed over the set of all observers and all observations for all times, but really where we should expect to see miracles is in and around the climactic moments of the story. Every great story has some sort of miracle or something like a miracle in the climactic moments. Even like a sports movie that you watch, there'll be some like crazy play that somehow the team miraculously wins, right? They miraculously snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. That's how every great story happens. And I think when we get to Christianity, what we see in Jesus is exactly that, where the hero remains uncorrupted and sacrifices for the good of the many, and then evil and death defeat themselves. That's like the story, the climax of every great story ever written. And I think that's where we would expect to see miracle, and that's where in the resurrection of Jesus we do see a miracle. So I think that's the key, is that if you're trying to approach the world as an atheist, miracles don't make any sense. If you try to approach Christianity as an atheist and say, Christianity just says there are a bunch of miracles. Miracles should happen. Why don't I see any miracles? It's only when we really understand the whole story of Christianity, the whole narrative of redemption, of what God is doing, that then I think the miracles start to make sense, and we start to see miracles exactly where we would expect them.
Thanks. That's a really good explanation. An interesting theory I haven't really thought about before, so that's cool. So some of these questions I kind of want to ask. A little bit more about the hiddenness of God and like how you reached conclusions, what some of your thoughts are on that, because that's something that I think comes up a lot when I'm talking to friends who are atheists.
So the hiddenness of God. Okay. I guess. So why doesn't God make it more obvious that He exists? And I definitely feel like I don't have a completely satisfying answer to this, but a few things that I can say. I guess there's a story I like to tell that a friend of mine pointed me to. It's in a book called Jesus Without Religion, I think, by Rick James, and he tells the story of a friend of his, missionary, who works in lots of different countries, telling people about Jesus. And in like the newsletter for this organization, they had this story about this woman who, upon hearing the good news of Jesus for the first time, she was a blind woman, and she was watching this Jesus film, this film about Jesus, and in the moment where Jesus heals a blind person in the movie, she exclaimed, "I want to see too." And then a little bit later, when Jesus was being put up on the cross, her sight miraculously came back, and she could see. So this is the story, and pretty remarkable story, pretty incredible miracle story, right? And the Rick James, told his friend or whatever that wow, this is that's an incredible story. And I used to hear stories like this a lot more from your organization. You used to talk about them a lot more. Like why do I hear so many less stories now? Did they just stop happening or what? And the guy said, no, it's not that they stopped happening. It's that we found that when we were reporting these stories, telling our supporters in the West, in the United States, in Europe, about all of these miracles that we were seeing, it actually had the opposite effect of what we wanted. It wasn't producing faith, it was producing skepticism. And I think that resonates a lot with me and probably a lot of people here, because I know that when I first heard that story, I'm like, well, come on, did that really happen? There's probably some other explanation for that. I think a lot of us, especially here in the West, as soon as we hear about these miracles, these actual manifestations of God, that we say, oh, there must be some other explanation for that. And so I think really what we learn about is not so much the question of whether miracles happen, whether God is hidden or not. I think what we're really learning about is our own skepticism. And you see this in Jesus' teaching too, where people come to him and they're demanding a sign. They want him to do a miracle. And he says, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it apart from the sign of Jonah. And it's funny because Jesus in other places has been doing miracles. Like he's done miraculous signs. He's fed the 5,000 or the 4,000. He's raised the dead. He's turned water into wine. He's done all of these things. And yet when people come to him and they demand a sign, he refuses to give it to them. I think that this is kind of what's going on here, where I think God does give himself to the people who really come to him in need, in desperation. But if we're coming to God kind of just with this idea of testing him, of wanting him to prove himself to us, that there's kind of this sense that, God doesn't need to do that. God doesn't owe us any sort of proof. So I think, ultimately the answer to the question of why is God hidden from us, it's not so much that God is hidden from us, it's more that we're hiding from God, and that God will make himself available to those of us who really need him most.
Thanks. That's a really good breakdown of that question. A question that I get sometimes that is also on this list, so I'm going to ask it, is what is your best explanation for when someone asks you, how do you know that we're not just in a simulation? How do you usually answer that question?
I'm really proud of my answer to this question. Okay, so here's the problem with a simulation. And I came up with this by myself, by the way.
Take notes, guys.
Maybe no one else will find it convincing. But suppose that we're in a simulation by some hyper intelligent species. There's some alien kid in his alien mom's basement, simulating everything that we see on a computer. The problem with that is that it would take such an incredible amount of computing power to simulate the dynamics of distant black holes in our world. For that same amount of computational price, you could simulate 10 to the 100th conscious minds just like that. So if we were in a simulation, I think it's overwhelmingly more probable that we would find ourselves essentially being like brains in vats, as opposed to living in this world of people who have inside this cosmos that's 14 billion light years across. It's just so inefficient. Now, you might ask, how does theism escape this same fate? The point is that the problem is a problem of efficiency, but efficiency is only a problem if you have finite time and finite resources. right? That's the issue if you're simulating this on a computer. Like you have to worry about computational resources. But if you're God, you just snap your fingers and you make anything you want, right? There's no issue of efficiency. So I think to me, what the conclusion is that if there is some sort of intelligence behind all of this, that ultimately whatever it is can't be limited in any way by efficiency.
Got it. That's a really good scientific and theoretical breakdown of that.
Thanks.
And I think another question that sort of I always think about when I ask the simulation question is also just there's a difference between okay, it's not a simulation, it's God, it's an intelligent being, but there's a difference between there being an intelligent being who's almost acting as if it was a simulation, sort of not caring about what happens, versus an intelligent being that's actively involved and cares about what happens to us. And so I'm wondering if you ever had a phase in your journey of faith where you were not an atheist but sort of agnostic, okay, maybe God's real, maybe there's enough theories but he doesn't care. I'm curious how you moved from that position to Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that should bother all of us kind of on this is, on the one hand you have fine tuning. On the one hand, you we don't just exist as conscious observers who are just totally irrational, who have just popped into existence. We actually exist in a world where we can interact with each other, where we can figure things out. We live in a world which it remarkably is conducive to the pursuit of science and knowledge. It's pretty incredible. Our brains are actually smart enough to be able to comprehend these really complicated laws of nature, that we can do complex analysis and algebraic geometry and understand Lie groups. Our sky, the night sky, is transparent, so that we can actually look out into these distant galaxies. That's not obvious at all, right? You could have imagined that our atmosphere would be just totally opaque and we can never see anything beyond that. So lots of things that are just really incredible, I think, and suggest that the universe, the designer, God, whatever you want to call it, has an interest in human beings. On the other hand, the flip side of that, you have the problem of evil and suffering, which is, okay, it seems like there might be something up to this world, that there may be something out there that cares about humans. Now, why on earth, if that thing cares about us so much, then how come we're all just gonna suffer for 80 years and then die? So I think, that's kind of the challenge, right? And I think I don't really know how to answer that without the resurrection. That I think that, in the resurrection, or first of all, in the incarnation, God proves that he does care about us despite suffering, that he's aware of suffering, and he cares about it so much because he himself was actually willing to come to earth and suffer and experience death himself. And ultimately, the resurrection gives us this hope that somehow all of this evil and suffering will someday be undone. That there is a happily ever after to the human story, and that somehow, in some way that I can't even envision yet, that all of the evil and suffering will somehow be healed and made up for, and the world will somehow be even greater for having once been broken and lost. So to me, that is really the beauty of Christianity, is that it's centered all around God's response to the problem of evil and suffering. That from the very beginning, opening chapter, opening scene in Genesis, where Adam and Eve bring evil into the world because of their disobedience, to the Psalms, to the book of Job, all the way through Jesus to the resurrection, that this whole faith is really about God's response to the problem of evil and suffering. And that, I guess, to me is what pushed me over the edge,
Another interesting question that just came up is, do you believe we have free will, or is our life all predeterministic?
Yeah, I think I believe in free will. I don't know exactly how that works. There's a set of or perspective of theological thought called Molinism that I'm kind of intrigued by, which is the idea that God has kind of foreseen what we would do in every situation and decided to bring about a world where all of our free choices are realized. So I think, I don't know, to me that seems like it fits pretty well with the with physics and how things work, but man, I don't really know this stuff. I feel like no one really does. It seems pretty complicated to me, but I think that free will makes sense. It's definitely something that we experience, right? We seem to have free will, and to me, that experience is stronger evidence than any of the like philosophical arguments that people have given against it. Like to me, I guess it's tough for me to explain, how exactly free will works in a world that's governed by these laws of physics. Excuse me, but I'd rather explain that than have to explain why it is that we all just we all feel like we have free will if there is no such thing. That to me seems like a worse thing to have to try to explain.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is the last question I'm going to ask, and then if you guys have more questions, Tom will be sticking around after. But some people in the chat have asked if you ever got to work for the NSA, and so I already know the answer because I read part of your book. But I think going off of that, if you just want to explain like how you went from that polygraph test to actually like committing to Christianity and the way that sort of has changed your life going forward. Short summary.
Yeah. Well, so I basically came out of the polygraph, my first polygraph, and it felt like something had changed. Like it felt like something was different about who I was. And I think by the end of the day, I kind of realized like, I think I'm a Christian now. I think this is it. My brother called me a couple of days later, and I'd sent him a message basically saying like, I think I'm a Christian now. And he asked me like, are you ready to put your faith in Jesus? And I was really close to being like, I don't think I'm ready yet. 'Cause it still just felt like such a big commitment. But it was also kind of like, well, if not now, then when, right? So I said, yeah, okay, I'm in. And so yeah, that was kind of, I just decided I was going to do it. I was going to go for it, and eventually got involved in like a church after a long time of dragging my feet, and eventually came to faith. But yeah, as far as the polygraphs, I failed 4 more polygraphs and never got the test. I never got the job. Yep.
Oh, wow. And I guess the like last thing, if you want to add just some details on like how you feel like, I don't know, one thing like maybe personally that really changed in your life after becoming a Christian.
Yeah, I think the 3 things that I would talk about, I guess, I feel like it gave me a lot of hope, kind of like my twin brother, hope that there's something more to this world than meets the eye, and hope that the suffering that I've gone through and that others have gone through will somehow be healed and made up for. A sense of meaning and purpose, that I haven't just been thrown into this mathematical structure to do what I will, but that there's actually something deeper and more fundamental that's true, that's the whole point of my life and why I'm here. And finally, a sense of community and even family that I've found in my Christian faith and my Christian community. And I think that's been something that's been really special to me as I've risen up the ranks of academia and kind of gotten further and further isolated inside this like ivory tower of string theory, that my faith community has really brought me into community with a lot of people from all different walks of life and backgrounds and races and socioeconomic classes and genders and everything that I never would have met if I, just being in that ivory tower. So that's something that's been really special to me as well.
Thank you so much for answering that question and all the questions tonight. If we want to give Tom a round of applause. And thank all of you guys too. You guys submitted some great questions. So if we can move on to the next slide. So yeah, we'd love right now if we could just take a couple of minutes. We have a feedback survey that we really want you guys to fill out. We're going to just play some music so it's not awkward, but you guys can have like 2 to 3 minutes to fill out the survey. And we are giving away an Amazon gift card of $25, I think, if you fill it out. So you have the chance to win. So yeah, do it now, scan the code, and we'll give it a couple minutes. And I did say we'd play music if it's to make it not awkward, so. Oh, the code is also on the flyer. So you don't have to put your phone all the way up. If you have your flyer, you can also scan that. Thanks.
crying. I've got a swollen eye from wrestling with demons every night. And Uncle Screwtape will be my last one. I've got 2 spare tires and 4 more county lines than exit signs. I'm on this road until my engine dies. I need you. If I'm being honest, I haven't been honest in a couple of years now. I need you. If the river I take is another step away from you, I don't want it. I've got a head for food and we're pushing 95. I'm speeding down the road until the engine dies. I need you.
We'll give you guys like just another minute. Yeah.
Righteous rage, hold me deep inside the tension every day. Can anger be holy if you don't let it eat clean through you? I'm an optimist when I close my eyes and clench my fists. The pain's in the mindset, so is denial. If I'm being honest, I haven't been honest.
Okay, we can come back together just so we can wrap this up. So hopefully you guys filled out that survey. 2 things that I wanted to mention really quick. We MIT crew have 2 groups. So if you guys really like this discussion and you want to like continue being able to talk about these types of issues of, you know, science and faith, or even just general like objections to the Bible, questions about Christianity, we have one group called Big Questions, which is sort of a more informal group. They meet on Saturdays, and this is just like getting together, eating some pizza, and asking tough questions and like sort of debating and having discussion with other students, a mix of non-Christian and Christian students. And then if you're more interested in actually like exploring Christianity in sort of like a class setting, in like a more organized format, we have a Christianity Explored group. And so there were options to check that you're interested in that on the survey. So make sure you do that if you are interested, or talk to some of us after about it. So I think we have one more slide, which is that if you haven't gotten the book that we've mentioned 100 times, definitely get the book. Also, Tom is here to sign copies or like answer any questions you have. He'll be at the table in the back for a little bit. But yeah, I think that wraps everything up. Thank you again so much for joining, guys, and have a good rest of your night.